Good evening, everyone. We heartily welcome you to today's event. Let's begin with a quick prayer. Father, by the love of your Spirit, may we who have experienced the grace of the Lord's resurrection rise to the newness of life in joy. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. My name is Michael, and I'm from the Newman Association of Vancouver. The Newman Association of Vancouver is a Catholic organization that promotes and cultivates the religious, intellectual, and social formation of its members and associates. It is named after St. John Henry Cardinal Newman, an Anglican convert to Catholicism, whose life story of conversion and writings on the idea of a university greatly inspired those working for the advancement of the liberal arts in the ideals of Catholic education, an inspiration that led to the start of the Newman movement around the world in the 20th century. Founded in 1940, the Newman Association extends the mission of the Newman Club of the University of British Columbia from the UBC campus to the wider community and brings issues of pertinence into discussion and dialogue through its activities in the local church. We are very glad that you can join us this evening. We will also be giving more information later on how you can formally or officially join us and be kept posted of our events and activities. Our Friday evening event takes place online with our speaker, Dr. Ian Benson, video conferencing with us all the way from Australia, where it is now Saturday morning. We are glad to have him over here for his very timely topic and discussion with you. You are welcome to ask questions through the Q&A button below. Please note that the chat function is intentionally disabled. And our host will select relevant questions from the audience mid-event onwards, time permitting. I would now like to pass on the Zoom floor to our question host, our very own intellectual chair, Dr. David Klassen, to present our guest speaker for the day.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Friday evening in Vancouver, noon Saturday in Australia. I have the pleasure of introducing my friend and colleague, Dr. Ian Benson. I met Ian in the early 1990s when we were members of the St. Thomas More Society of Catholic Lawyers. We met in the cafeteria of St. Paul's Hospital in downtown Vancouver, where Father John Horgan was our chaplain. Ian soon moved on from his position as a senior solicitor for the Labor Relations Board of British Columbia, and he became the senior research fellow for the Center for Cultural Renewal in Ottawa, where he stayed for 15 years, first as research fellow and then as the center's first executive director. I lost track of him for many years, but later heard he'd moved to France near Lourdes, and from there to South Africa. He was appointed a professor extraordinary in the Faculty of Law at the University of the Free State, and that's an ongoing appointment for him. I'm going to cut this a little bit short. I had a long introduction with all his accomplishments, but he wants to concentrate on George Grant. So I'll just say a couple more things. His achievements are too numerous to mention, but they include the practice of law at all levels of court in Canada, including reading rights cases, and many distinguished appointments and directorships in Canada and abroad. He's published over 50 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, as well as 2 books. You can read all about him on Wikipedia, all the details, and we have a pretty thorough introduction of him for this webinar that you may have read. Ian is most qualified to speak to us today on the topic of the very prominent Canadian philosopher George Grant, with whom Ian had personal communications in the years before Grant's untimely death in 1988. So he got to know him pretty well, and as well as his wife Sheila. And I'm really looking forward to hearing about that. Without further ado, Dr. Ian Benson.
Thanks, David. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Newman Association for this opportunity to share some thoughts on a wonderful couple. I'll also be talking today about Sheila Grant for reasons that will become evident. But I may say that for me, this is an opportunity that comes with tremendous gratitude because I feel I owe a huge debt to George Grant and to Sheila. I never met George in the flesh. I had an invitation to go to Halifax to stay with them. And the last telegram I ever received was from Sheila saying that George had gone into hospital and that we would reschedule the visit in Halifax for when he came out. Sadly, he had pancreatic cancer and he expired pretty quickly after his diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. So he died just about a month short of his 70th birthday, with having left a body of work that will stand the test of time, has influenced many people, primarily in Canada. But I'd like now to turn to him and to Sheila Grant in gratitude, and also remember other people scholars in this area who've also passed on, but were friends or involved in the work we did at the Center for Cultural Renewal. And I'm thinking particularly of Peter Emberley, who edited a wonderful collection of essays on Grant called By Loving Our Own, which is a line taken from the classical authors. By loving our own, we can gain an appreciation of the good. Grant loved that line, and it was influential to him, as indeed particularly were the ancient philosophers. Grant was, as I'll say, as you'll hear from me, he was an unusual person in the sense that his interest in truth was such that he read very broadly, right across the religions, and he didn't like labels like left or right for reasons that I'll explain. He was very popular with students, a beloved teacher, and he attracted people from all sectors because of his honesty and his openness to the truth, really. Now, my paper today is divided into three parts. It's divided into part one, which is the discussion of George and Sheila Grant and what I'm calling the problem of maintaining tradition. The second part is on natural law itself. And the third part is on values language and how that relates to this idea of maintaining a tradition. Or, as I'll argue, drawing on George Grant's work in this area, compromises our ability to not only maintain a tradition, but even to understand it. Grant will say, and you'll hear this in a variety of ways in what I'm going to read to you, that our ability to understand ourselves is compromised by technology, by our understanding of history, and by our understanding of nature. And these three notions, and there's others as well, Grant himself gave lists of terms that he believed we had to understand anew in our contemporary context in order to even begin to appreciate the kind of dilemma we're in. So, George Grant was born in 1918. My connection, he dies in 1988, in November of 88. I met him spoke to him in 1987. And I first really it's hard to remember what the first encounters were, but they were literary. They were through a friend, Robert Grant, no relation, with whom I articled in a law firm in Vancouver. He gave me for Christmas, I have the dates written in all my books. He gave me a copy of one of Grant's books. And I read it with astonishment because it was so clear and compelling. This made me realize this was somebody that I wanted to get to know if I could. And I wanted, because I was then chairing a section of the British Columbia Bar, the civil liberties section. I was always interested in human rights and civil liberties. You have to remember 1987 was about the time Canada was embroiled in what we would now call the abortion debates. And Grant himself was deeply involved in this, as was his wife, Sheila. Now, George and Sheila met at Oxford University. George Grant was a Rhodes Scholar from Queen's University to Oxford. He was there, he arrived just weeks after the war started. And Oxford, of course, didn't continue normally at all. It was probably COVID times 100. People were, classes were eventually suspended. Grant ended up doing what he called his war work, which as a pacifist involved him doing various jobs related to air raid control initially in London, where he saw some of the worst bombing. In Bermondsey, many people killed, helped pull people out of destroyed buildings and so on. He met Sheila Grant at Oxford. She was studying English literature. He initially went there to study law. For one reason or another, he got sick, he got tuberculosis, he had to leave. But he met Sheila Grant at the meetings of the Socratic Club that were presided over by C.S. Lewis. In a letter to me, I should mention that though I never met him in the flesh, we corresponded, and I have letters from him, one of which talks about his relationship with C.S. Lewis and the importance Lewis's thought had for him. Sheila, for her part, was an intellectual. She died in 2009. She was very interested in the euthanasia and abortion issues and worked very closely with George Grant. When I invited George to speak on a panel at the Bar Midwinter Conference of the BC Bar in 1987, people thought that was a real long shot because Grant was quite famous in Canada at this point. His book, Lament for a Nation, which is probably his best known book, is still on the curriculum for most political science courses, and it is an extraordinary book. Often misunderstood, as Sheila Grant pointed out in her afterword to the republication of the book. But I would recommend anyone who's really interested in the themes I'm touching on today to look at Lament for a Nation, George Grant's extraordinary book about Canada and about the difficulty of maintaining allegiance to a tradition in the conditions of modernity. Put it that way. She knew Elizabeth Anscombe when she was at Oxford, and Elizabeth Anscombe is somebody who is extraordinarily important in philosophy. She wrote an article called Modern Philosophy in 1958, which is now recognized as being a real classic in 20th century philosophy. So, and Elizabeth Anscombe, had many children, was involved in anti-nuclear protests, chained herself to a fence. Parliament in England, was arrested for it, was very strongly pro-life. So there were these pro-life intellectuals, Anscombe a Catholic, Sheila Allen, as she was then called, raised a Catholic, but then with George, they were Anglicans, not Catholics, but deeply committed to understanding life in the context of developing culture. So I wrote to Grant, asked him if he would speak at our conference on the topic of when do human rights begin? The abortion debate starting, it seemed to me we might look at that question of when do human rights begin as a way into the whole question of the status of the unborn. He agreed to come, but sadly before he arrived, he had to cancel because it was a long flight from Halifax to Vancouver and he had a bad back. That may have been the beginnings of his cancer, I don't know, but he was to die, as I said, just about a year later. Of course, none of us knew that was in the works. But he sent Sheila. He said, Sheila will come and give a paper, and she'll give a very fine paper. And of course, I was really keen to have her, and she did come out. And he said this, Grant, in his last book, Technology and Justice, which is published in 1986. Grant published his books with small publishers in Canada. He didn't, as some Canadian philosophers, particularly Charles Taylor, have done, publish with prestigious American publishers such as Harvard. Charles Taylor's books are very well known in part because of marketing, but they're also brilliant. But Grant's are not. They're brilliant. They're much shorter than Charles Taylor's, to say the least, but they're published by House of Anansi Press, which published Technology and Empire, one of his most famous books. But in 1986, he published Technology and Justice, and he said this of Sheila. All that I write proceeds from sustained discussion with my wife. In that sense, she is the co-author of my writing and explicitly named as such in the articles about euthanasia and abortion. I think it's important to remember that because sometimes the wives of great people get overlooked. And many of us who have been married know the importance of our wives to our work and to our lives. And in George Grant's case with Sheila, they had 6 children. He was a man of extraordinary principle. He resigned a job because he refused to teach the textbook he was being required to teach, because he thought it was untrue to Christianity and to Plato. He said it perverted them both and he wouldn't teach it. He then resigned, and he had 6 children at the time and no other job. And I think his example in being able to take that kind of principled stand said a lot about his character as a man. So let's begin then the question of tradition. First of all, however, there's an anecdote I must tell you, because otherwise you won't know it. When Sheila came to give her paper at the conference, we had Ted Kaiserlink, very famous ethicist, a very skilled Vancouver lawyer by the name of Nancy Dillon, and Sheila Grant on the panel, and I moderated. And in the audience there's a large audience of people. The lawyer Tom Berger was there, a very famous lawyer, and Kim Campbell was there. She was then in provincial politics, but would go on to be Canada's first female prime minister. She sort of stood up after the presentation and said, I don't know why we are concerned about abortion the way we are, because there are fertilized ova that quite naturally are lost in miscarriages. So I don't see why, because women miscarry, we should be concerned about the abortion issue. And Sheila leaned over to me and said, is that woman being serious? And I said, yeah, she is. And she said, well, may I respond? I said, absolutely. So Sheila said, I would like to respond by saying that it might happen that 2 people are walking along a cliff and one of them falls off. But this doesn't mean that because one person in one situation fell off the cliff, we would allow someone else in another situation to push them off the cliff. Well, of course, the analogy to the abortion issue was obvious, and the entire room erupted in laughter, and Kim Campbell went bright red with embarrassment and sat down. I thought that should be captured for posterity because it was such a sweet moment and indicated in some respects the vast gap that existed between the ethics and approaches to ethics that some people were taking on the abortion issue and others. The Morgentaler decision was to come down shortly, in 1988. And George Grant said of that at the time, he was a very public intellectual. He would give lots of radio talks and things, and he made himself accessible, and he didn't shy away from controversial subjects. In the commentary on CBC that he gave in March of 1988, which is it's about 6 months before he is to die from his cancer, he said this in his commentary: of course, the attack on the weak through abortion is duplicated in the euthanasia, which is now widely practiced against born infants who are defective and therefore inconvenient. It is surely the mark of a civilized country how it treats those who are dependent on the care of others. And it must never be forgotten that all of us at different times and different occasions are weak and dependent on other people. Current thought in our society dissolves the reasons for care for human life because many people no longer believe there is anything sacred about it. At those points where care is most necessary for fetuses, for the retarded infants, for the old, for the weak, of many other kinds, care is lessening. The degrading of respect for human life does not portend well for the future of our technological society. So that's the kind of position that Grant would take publicly. And with his tremendous reputation, he was a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada by that point, and was quite famous, as I said, because of his book, Lament for a Nation. He added intellectual heft to that very controversial issue that many people shied away from taking any public position with respect to. I commend to you the wonderful interviews that David Cayley did over 5 days with George Grant in 1995, or sorry, in 1985. The book that comes out of those interviews is called George Grant in Conversation. It's still in print from Anansi in Toronto. I'll be reading a couple of quotations from it later on. But these are luminous interviews, and David Cayley is one of Canada's national treasures, in my view. I think he's one of the finest journalists we ever produced. His writing on Ivan Illich, Notre, George Grant is just superb. And the interviews are available on his website, davidcayley.com, CAYLEY.com. Please go and listen to those interviews with George Grant. The whole book is there, and or at least part of that book is there, and you can hear Grant's speech and you get a sense of what he was like. Grant read very broadly. He read, as I said, not just the classical authors, Plato and Aristotle and so forth, but he also read Rousseau, Hegel, Heidegger, and Simone Weil, or Weil as he called her, the French mystic who dies in her 30s and has been influential and commented upon by so many people. T.S. Eliot, for example, who writes the introduction to her book, The Need for Roots. Alice, you might be interested in hearing what a leading American philosopher, two of them, Alistair McIntyre and Stanley Hauerwas, said of Grant in the introduction to the American reissue of English-Speaking Justice, a book to which I'll refer in a few minutes on the question of Grant's concern about tradition. Alistair McIntyre becomes extremely famous for a book he publishes in 1981 called After Virtue. But in commenting on Grant, they want to say, why is this person so little known out in America? And they say this about George Parkin Grant, his middle name was Parkin, about his writings on moral and political theory, two things need to be said. First, they are amongst the most interesting North American work in that area to be produced since 1945. And they are almost entirely unknown in the United States. Partly this is because of our Americans' Philistine parochialism, which steadfastly refuses to acknowledge either the diversity or the interdependence of the various North American cultures, so that Mexican as well as Canadian voices go unheard. Grant, so high praise indeed from a leading, by any standards, of contemporary American philosopher in the form of Alistair McIntyre, at any rate. In Lament for a Nation, the book I've referred to already, he says, it is the very signature of modern man to deny reality to any conception of good that imposes limits on human freedom. To modern political theory, man's essence is his freedom. Nothing must stand in the way of our absolute freedom to create the world as we want it. There must be no conception of the good that puts limitations on human action. This definition of man as freedom constitutes the heart of the age of progress. Now, understand that when Grant uses the term age of progress, he uses it in an ironic way. He doesn't really believe in progress. He doesn't believe in that reading of history, a point he makes clear in his Massey lectures, which come out under the title Time as History. Also well worth reading and short. These are short books, but very dense in the sense of compact. They're luminously brilliant, but they require work, and they repay that work in spades. So for Grant, the doctrine of progress, I'm now quoting Grant again, is not, as Marx believed, the perfectibility of man, but of an open-ended progression in which men will be endlessly free to make the world as they want it. In Marxism, technology remains an instrument that serves human good, but many technologists speak of it as if mastery were an end in itself. To conquer space, it may be necessary to transcend ordinary humanity and produce creatures half flesh and half metal. He writes this book in 1965. So I leave it to you to see how brilliant that is in light of what we see happening with Elon Musk and other technologists who are fully moving ahead in the integration of man and machine, as we might say. And some of the work of Yuval Harari on Homo Deus and his other work, his lectures on YouTube before Silicon Valley audiences, suggest that technology is well aware of this blending of the self with the external technology. For Grant, right and left are really just different species of liberalism. And for liberalism, Grant means that the essence of a human person is freedom and to make the world as they want it. Ancient philosophy gives alternative answers, says Grant at page 96 of Lament for a Nation. And he says, tradition is the best basis for the practical life, in contradistinction to this ever endlessly plastic conception that we're in. Grant also understood something else very important. He understood that this movement of technology and this unlimited freedom of people to make the world as they want it would lead in the direction of tyranny. Here he follows the great influence of Leo Strauss on his work. He sees and studies the exchange between Kojève and Strauss, in which they talk about the creation of what they know as the unitive and homogeneous state, this global oneness where everything's the same. We're moving toward, we would call it now for shorthand perhaps, or as part of it anyway, globalism, the move towards sameness, everything the same. Something that, of course, Chesterton spent his life criticizing, and the Catholic Church in its social doctrine stands strongly against in its three great social principles. Solidarity, the moral content of our relationship with one another in love, and subsidiarity, the organizing principle that things should be organized diversely and as much as possible properly at the local level. Then they build outwards. And the result of that moral principle of solidarity in conjunction with the organizing principle, subsidiarity, gives us the third principle and result, which is justice and the common good. So for Grant, the common good required a certain involvement of the state. Grant was not anti-state. He was not, in this sense, a conservative of a certain kind of American sort that wants the minimal state or no state at all. He believed the state had an important function, but it had to be understood in relation to human goods themselves. I want to, at this point, quote something really important from an earlier writer that I think epitomizes the frame within which we can understand Grant's thinking here on tyranny. I'm reading from the Hungarian polymath, meaning he knew a lot about a lot of things, Michael Polanyi, and he says this: the adherents of a great tradition are largely unaware of their own premises, which lie deeply embedded in the unconscious foundations of practice. If the citizens are dedicated to certain transcendent obligations, and particularly to such general ideals as truth, justice, charity, and these are embodied in the tradition of the community to which allegiance is maintained, a great many issues between citizens, and all to some extent, can be left and are necessarily left for the individual consciences to decide. The moment, however, a community ceases to be dedicated through its members to transcendent ideals, it can continue to exist undisrupted only by submission to a single center of unlimited secular power. That's Michael Polanyi writing in 1946 in a book called Science, Faith, and Society. Now, he didn't, I haven't found any reference to Michael Polanyi in Grant's work, but Grant would have endorsed that and understood the connection between this commitment to transcendental goods, to these metaphysical realities, and the liberty of the person in community. This would be home territory for Grant in his thinking about the good. The tragedy of modern society, according to Joan O'Donovan in her wonderful book, George Grant and the Twilight of Justice, is the paradox of modern freedom, And Grant's writings of the early 60s formulate this paradox as follows. Freedom as a practical and theoretical idea is the modern tradition. The modern tradition of freedom, with its roots in the religious consciousness of the Reformation, is the dissolvent. It dissolves all the traditions outside itself, and it's the negation of tradition as such. The hegemony of technological freedom in modern society is therefore implied by the tradition negating logic of the modern tradition. The modern tradition is the last tradition. It is the overcoming of tradition as a vehicle of truth and justice. And Grant's rejection of history, in this sense, is his recognition of this loss. What a splendid passage from Joan O'Donovan. Chapter 4 of her book on the twilight of justice is called The Vanishing of Tradition. I don't have time to go into her writing here, except to note that what she says is that Grant's statement of conservative principles makes it clear why the modern tradition of technological liberalism is tradition negating, and as such tyrannous. So we have there a link between Grant and Polanyi and these others who've seen this coming world order linked profoundly to technology as working in the direction of an evisceration, of a deracination of human freedom. So now, this brings me to the quiddity of my talk before I move into discussing natural law in Grant's thought. Grant brings us to the cliff edge of this analysis in his book, English-Speaking Justice, which is his response to the Roe and Wade decision of the US Supreme Court in 1973. The book I'm referring to is called English-Speaking Justice, and in it, he is discussing the limitations of what's known as contractualism or contractarianism in the work of John Rawls, the influential writer of the idea of theory of justice, the theory of justice. The idea of justice is later by Amartya Sen and is a very deep and I think complete critique of Rawls. But Grant wants to mount a critique of Rawls, and he says this. I'm just going to quickly go through these points. They're very powerful. What is it which divides adults from fetuses when the latter have only to cross the bridge of time to catch up with the former? What is it, if anything, about human beings that makes the rights of equal justice their due? Remember, justice is defined in the tradition as rendering to another or to God what is due to them. It's regulation and order. What is it about human beings that makes it good that they should have such rights? What is it about any of us that makes our just due fuller than that of stones or flies or chickens or bears, he asks. For the last centuries, a civilizational contradiction has moved our Western lives. Our greatest intellectual endeavor, the new co-penetration of logos and techne, logos meaning word or plan, and techne meaning skills or art. We get our word technician, technique, technology from skills or arts, but the Greeks understood that you could only evaluate a techne, a skill or an art, in relation to its telos, its purpose, or its end. Techne just gives us hows, doesn't give us whys. The whys are given by teleology, by telos. And logos is plan or word. And in the beginning of John's gospel, of course, we're told in the lovely Latin, in principio erat verbum, in the beginning was the word, and the word becomes flesh and dwells amongst us. This is the most extraordinary linkage of the Greek and classical mind with the kerygma, or the good news, or gospel of the New Testament. Grant was a deeply a Christian. He called himself at one point born again, based on an experience he had in England during the war, where he came to a really deep Christian faith. And when he went back to Oxford, he did his doctorate in religious studies, not in law. He moved, as it sometimes said, from law to grace. So the ancient understanding of good is, in this modern world, increasingly eliminated from everything. Here we're going to see a direct tie in a minute with C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, which Grant had written to me in a letter saying he was so pleased that I was using the abolition of man in my legal writing in articles related to the abortion issue. Some of these have been published long ago now. It's hard to believe it's 34 years ago that all of these, this connection with George and Sheila Grant occurred. Time is, yeah, it's a brutal thing sometimes, but it's also has its beauty in a way. So the view of traditional philosophy and religion is that justice is the overriding order which we do not measure and define, but in terms of which we are measured and defined. The view of modern thought is that justice is a way which we choose in freedom, both individual and publicly, once we have taken our fate into our own hands and know that we are responsible for what happens. So what happens is what he calls a terrifying darkness descends on contemporary justice. The twilight that Joan O'Donovan referred to, the twilight of justice. This dimming takes place in the hardly conscious assumption that while there has been change as to what can be known in philosophy and change in the prevalence of religious belief among the educated, the basic content of justice in our societies will somehow remain the same. Grant says that this kind of secularized Christianity, this sense of the maintenance of equality without the ability to say why there's dignity or why there's equality, what is it really rooted in? This is a kind of delusion, a kind of unreal state of affairs that we live in, hence the twilight of justice. So he wants us as powerfully as he can to point out that there is a terrifying darkness that's descended on contemporary justice because we've lost the way that the pieces interconnect. Okay, this brings us to the important Grantian word here, enucleation. Grant loved the word enucleate, sometimes to some people's frustration. Enucleate means to get at the kernel or core of something. I normally never use it, but in speaking with genuine affection for George Grant, I feel it's appropriate to use the term. So we shall now enucleate C.S. Lewis. Hope he doesn't mind, but here we are. The Abolition of Man, from section 3 of that extraordinary book. 3 parts or 4 parts to the Abolition of Man. Walter Hooper, Lewis's literary executor, told me once in Oxford, he thought it was Lewis's most important book. Of course, Lewis is most famous for Mere Christianity and even more famous for the Narnia stories. But Hooper and many other people who know Lewis's work and have written on it agree that the Abolition of Man is extremely important. If you haven't read it, please read it. It's not easy, but it repays, again, the work that it takes to understand it. So it's divided into 4 parts. The first part is called Men Without Chests. The second part is called The Way, or the Tao. And the third is called The Abolition of Man. The fourth is an appendix giving what he calls illustrations of the Tao or the Way. And he draws them from all the different world religions and ethical codes. He wants to show that our contemporary assumption, or the assumption we make about cultural relativism, is actually untrue. It's inaccurate. Now, I take all my students in law because legal philosophy is a compulsory course at my university, and I teach the course. All of them read this book, The Abolition of Man, and all of them discuss Sophocles' Antigone to get at the perennial questions of eternity and time that are so key to our lives. Grant understood the importance of how we understand time and time as history, which is why he gives his Massey lectures under that title. But here, we need to understand something in Lewis that I want to take us to now. He says in the Abolition of Man section, why our approach to tradition that we're now using will destroy us. Why will it destroy us? I'm going to come around to this in my conclusion in a few minutes, but at this stage, let's just deal with Lewis in the 3rd section of the Abolition of Man. He says, you will find people who write about the 16th century as if magic were a medieval survival and science the new thing that came in to sweep it away. Those who have studied the period know better. There was very little magic in the Middle Ages. The 16th and 17th centuries are the high noon of magic. The serious magical endeavor and the serious scientific endeavor are twins. There is something which unites magic and applied science while separating both from the wisdom of earlier ages. Well, this is really important. For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. The solution is a technique, and both in the practice of this technique are ready to do things hitherto regarded as disgusting or impious or impious, such as digging up and mutilating the dead. It might be going too far to say that the modern scientific movement was tainted from its birth, but I think it would be true to say that it was born in an unhealthy neighborhood and at an inauspicious hour. Its triumphs may have been too rapid and purchased at too high a price. Reconsideration and something like repentance may be required. Is it then possible to imagine a new natural philosophy continually conscious that the natural object produced by analysis and abstraction is not reality but only a view, and always correcting the abstraction? Lewis says, I hardly know what I'm asking for. I hear rumor, I can skip the next little bit. When this new science approach to science would arise, it would speak of the parts by remembering the whole. While studying the it would not lose what Martin Buber calls the thou situation. Okay, that is exactly the kind of articulation we're going to read in Grant. It's all through Grant. Grant had this sense of what C.S. Lewis elsewhere in a preface to a book says the history of philosophy for the last several centuries has been what he says in a very wonderful expression, the inflation of the subject and the deflation of the object. The world of I, me, my becomes more and more important, and feelings become everything. And what we ought to do or obliged to do, or what that self is in relation to, shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. Lewis concludes the third chapter this way. Because we have to use numbers so much, we tend to think of every process as if it must be like the numeral series, where every step to all eternity is the same kind of step as the one before. I implore you to, he says, there are progressions in which the last step is sui generis, incommensurable with the others, and in which to go the whole way is to undo all the labor of your previous journey. To reduce the Tao, or the way, the natural law we're going to describe in a minute, to a mere natural product is a step of that kind. Up to that point, the kind of explanation which explains things away may give us something, though at a heavy cost. But you cannot go explaining away forever. You will find that you have explained explanation itself away. You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is good that the window should be transparent because the street or garden beyond it is opaque. How if you saw through the garden too? It is no use trying to see through first principles. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see. Absolutely brilliant. And when Grant wrote to me and said he was so gratified that I was using Lewis's Abolition of Man, it was because he believed it was an extremely important book. And I believe so too, and which is why I'm sharing it with you in conjunction with Grant at the moment. Because Grant's writings and Lewis's writings both deal with different aspects of how we understand a tradition and ourselves within it. Lament for a Nation, the subtext of that book is really about tradition, about the impossibility of Canada, as he eventually calls it. He says it may be necessary that Canada disappear. He doesn't want it to because he revered and loved what he saw as the genuine traditions that made up Canada, as we may revere and love the genuine traditions that make up wherever we are. And I think there's quite a lot of different people in different countries on this call, on this webinar. We are instantiated beings as human beings. We're in a place amongst a people, in a language, in a tradition. And these things make us what we are. The problem with globalization, this homogeneous nowhereness, this view from nowhere in terms of morals, and nowhere as a home, as Heidegger often speaks about the importance of home. We become rootless, we become lost, we drift without law, without purpose, without a sense of anything being true. That anomie, as Weber and Durkheim, the early sociologists, referred to it, this drifting person without law. So Grant wants to take us to this now, and he does so brilliantly in his book, Philosophy in the Mass Age. I won't have time to get into it as much as I'd like. My students, if they're on this call, will be chuckling because they know that this, what I'm about to now compress into a few minutes, takes at least a 3-hour lecture when we do it full on. But in any case, I'll do my best. This is from chapter 3, the introduction, and chapter 3 of Grant's book, Philosophy in the Mass Age. Chapter 3 is simply headed Natural Law. And it is, in my opinion, the most succinct and clear explanation of classical natural law thought. There's new natural law. I'm not going to get into that, but it's a very important. John Finnis is one of the major proponents of that, and he's being contested by my good friend Russell Hittinger, who has critiqued Finnis in a way. So there's a natural, and Robbie George is involved in it. There's a wonderful, now effervescent discussion of natural law that there wasn't before Finnis wrote his book in 1981. But Grant is talking here about an earlier account of natural law, and it's made up of these parts. And I'm just going to fly through them with a almost improper speed. That's just the way it is, I'm afraid. Let me start with this. I've given you the techne-telos distinction. You can only evaluate a technique if you know what it's for, what its purpose is. Alistair McIntyre is to discuss this as the answer to the so-called naturalistic fallacy of Hume, that you can't get an ought from an is. Purpose is the thing, and purpose is how we understand the cosmos in the old account. So technique, when it becomes victorious, tends to emerge out of a non-cosmological understanding of the universe. For the old understanding, everything had a purpose, everything had a meaning. You do, a rock does, a plant does. Everything had a purpose within the whole. There was an order in the universe that reason could perceive. So first we have cosmos, an ordered purpose and end. Second, human reason engages this. So what makes human beings distinct is their capacity to reason and ultimately to love. But of course, that's grace perfecting nature, right? So you have cosmos, human reason, human nature that we all share. We have certain capacities and certain things. Fourthly, metaphysics, essential that we teach and understand metaphysics. Well, of course, we don't teach metaphysics anymore. What is metaphysics? It's the study of being and of causes. And as Huxley understood, who writes the famous dystopia, Brave New World, Huxley writes in his book Ends and Means you can have a good metaphysics or you can have a bad metaphysics, but one thing you cannot have is no metaphysics. What does this mean? This means that in our contemporary world, where we don't teach metaphysics and most people don't learn it, they're functioning with an implicit metaphysics that they don't even evaluate. Everything's slipped to the implicit side. It's like the lousy language we use about belief. We speak about believers and unbelievers. We speak about faith as if we mean religious faith. Everyone's a believer and everyone has faith. The question isn't whether they have them, but what they're in. It's our contemporary blindness that lets us speak in these terms where we've abstracted faith and belief out of our day-to-day reality. Everyone has faith. Newman said, and I feel I can invoke Newman here at a Newman Association meeting. Newman said once in one of his talks, to act is to assume, and to assume is to have faith. Human beings are necessarily assuming beings. We assume all kinds of realities. I order food in a restaurant. I assume it's not laced with arsenic. I don't know the chef. May never have eaten in the restaurant. So far, it hasn't contained arsenic. Why? Well, in part because I have faith that it's what it purports to be. But it's a faith. It's a belief in things that I don't measure. I could measure them, but I don't. Well, the same thing. Our language is deracinated. It's what we have now, Grant says, is that technique is victorious. Nature, in a situation where technique has become victorious, the focus of everything, skills, and you think about our language about skills. We want skills education, skills education, skills education, techniques. We separate things from their ends. We don't ask the questions about why. Medicine becomes technical. Politics becomes technical. Law becomes technical. Aristotle says in the Nicomachean Ethics that the student of politics must first study the soul and virtues above all things. Why? Well, you can't order a political society if you don't know what virtues are. And from the Greeks, justice, wisdom, moderation, and courage, the four cardinal virtues, are then in the Christian tradition perfected by the three theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. Grace perfects nature. That's our understanding. But who can now name the virtues even? Everybody can talk about values, and I want to shift to that in a minute. We have, says Grant, a religion of progress. We have a theology of technology. And the theology of liberalism is technique, he says. We believe everything can be fixed through technique, through technology. This is nonsense. And look at what happens when you give the wrong science the control levers. Lewis, in an essay called Willing Slaves of the Welfare State, says he wouldn't want to live in a society where public policy is determined by doctors. Well, what are we living in now? What is COVID? What is this world situation we're in if it's not public policy being determined by doctors? And why are they doing public policy? They don't understand what a flourishing life entails. They can only tell you about viruses. So the result is, to a hammer, everything is said to look like a nail. To a medical professional nowadays, everything looks like a virus. And to a politician, everything looks like avoidance. Pass the buck. Don't put me on the hot seat. I'll delegate all of my political ordering and virtue analysis to doctors who haven't been trained to deal with human flourishing and the soul and what makes for a joyful community. I have a friend here who died last year in palliative care. He wasn't allowed to have visitors. Why? Because he might get a virus. He's dying. This is social pathology, not medicine. But we're in the midst of it globally. It's a massive reality of absurdity that we're currently in. In any case, I didn't come here, as they say, to talk about COVID. I came to talk about George Grant and natural law. So I've said, let's go back. Cosmos, human nature, human reason, metaphysics. And what's the fifth thing that he draws out in this chapter? Absolutely key: education. We have to be taught and into a tradition. We learn a tradition through its educative frameworks. Well, where are we? As I've said, people come to the classes, they don't know what a virtue is, much less tell you what they meant classically or historically. So what's happened to the language of virtue and the categories of virtue? What's been swamped by values? Values language, says George Grant in that superb interview with David Cayley. Values language is an obscuring language for morality, used when the idea of purpose has been destroyed. I get my students to write this down and memorize it. One of them, blessed soul, gave it to me on a coffee cup. Values language is an obscuring language for morality, used when the idea of purpose has been destroyed. And that's why it's so dominant in our culture. You have your values, I have mine, don't push yours on me. It's the perfect plasticity for the world of the subjective self that's now inflated to madness. But the object, virtue, justice, wisdom, moderation, courage, what I owe to you in love and as a citizen or as a friend, this is diminished. Categories, all the moral categories are reduced. They're deracinated. So Grant calls psychiatry a new ministry. Reasonable discussion of moral purposes has therefore almost entirely disappeared from our schools and universities, page 38. When the doctrine of natural law is compared with modern theories about morality, one issue stands out as a central point of divergence. It is this point of divergence I want to emphasize more than anything else in these essays, says Grant. To put this issue simply, are we truly and finally responsible for shaping what happens in the world, or do we live in an order for which we are not ultimately responsible, so that the purpose of our lives is to discover and serve that order? In natural law theory, it is clear that man is not finally responsible for what happens in the world. He chooses to conform or not to conform to an order which he himself does not make. But as the individual only has reality within the system, if he chooses not to conform, then the order simply breaks him and brings his efforts to naught. To go against the natural law is both for society and the individual to descend into chaos and nothingness. Cosmos or chaos? Chaos is the abyss. It's the abyss. We become free, says Grant, only insofar as we base our relevant actions on the law. We lose our freedom as we disregard that law. Thus, in traditional Christian theory, the highest stage of the good life is to be beyond choice. And as he quotes George MacDonald, the Scottish theologian who was so influential, Scottish novelist actually, and lay theologian like Lewis himself, or like Chesterton. He quotes George MacDonald, the first principle of hell is, I am my own. Are we our own or not our own? Asks Grant at the end of this. It's to ask that question is not to imply any kind of intelligible answer can be discovered simply or quickly. To begin to answer such a question would first require a careful analysis of such words as freedom, law, adoration, the making of history, and many others. We have moved into a period of abstraction and plasticity. I sometimes say to my students, virtue is to values as sex is to gender. Abstraction of equality, abstraction of discrimination. These things are taking us away from the reality that is present in things. So George Grant dies in 1988. He's buried in near Halifax, near Terrence Bay, Nova Scotia. On his gravestones are carved the words, out of the shadows and imaginings into the truth. The same epitaph as on the gravestone of another person, Cardinal John Henry Newman. And on that note, I'm at the end of my time, and I'm afraid I didn't give adequate coverage to the problem of values language. I'll just say this, that to think that values can tell us about the beautiful, the good, and the true is like trying to bail a boat using a sieve. You can have lots of activity about values. You can be Catholics talking about values, or even popes talking about values, as we've seen in not too distant past. But I'm afraid that what we've inherited from Shaler and phenomenology has been the wrong direction. Values in the contemporary frame is understood to be entirely personal and subjective. That's why you have yours and I have mine. Don't push yours on me. Grant never turned away from or sought to escape the modern world. He did, however, argue that the catastrophes of this century must lead us to reject the optimism inherent in the idea of human progress. He thought the tragedies of the 20th century were driving most sensitive and thoughtful people away from the religion of progress. He hoped this movement would take them not into nihilism, but towards a deeper religious response, one that would unite modern and traditional insights. So says Arthur Davis in his wonderful introduction to George Grant and the Subversion of Modernity. With that, I will conclude my remarks. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Benson, for the wonderful lecture and the reminiscences of George and Sheila Grant, talked of natural law and virtues and values, and it's all very stimulating, and I'm sure everyone found it really enlightening. And it's time now for some questions from the audience, and I see there are some posted all together already. And people have put their names up, and I wouldn't mind mentioning their names. But if people want to stay anonymous, please put that on there, and I can pose your question. I won't mention your name. So I'll just take these one at a time. Here's one from Lane Walker. Do you think Rod Dreher, the Benedict option, is a good viruses model or a reaction from conservative loss of cultural hegemony?
Well, first of all, for the question to have any meaning for the audience, they'd need to understand what Rod Dreher is about when he speaks about the Benedict option. I hope, Lane, that I'm not getting this wrong when I say this. The Benedict option, as I understand it, is the idea that we need to consider, in a sense, a strategic withdrawal from involvement in the culture that we're in. That the culture is so corrosive and corrupting that the only thing we can do to be faithful in our communities and to our lives as Catholics and Christians is a certain form of withdrawal. Now, this raises an issue, I think, about what it means to be fully in but not of the world, that what we're told to be in the book of Romans, in but not of the world. What does that mean? I think for some people who believe this is their way, on reflection and prayerful consideration and consultation with others, it may mean living alternatively, living in different ways, restructuring how they do commerce, how they do education. And some of that's already ongoing with different forms of practice in various countries. Some countries don't allow home education, for example, others do. And in some places it's growing quite quickly. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think the answer to this is that there's no one solution. There's no one size fits all. It's really important that people make these determinations personally and in community and with their friends. I would not want to see a withdrawal from the world because we're told not to do that. We're told to be in it, but not of it.
Thanks very much, Ian. I have a few questions from Paul Barnes, and I'll just select one of them. He says, it seems that a lot of what Grant wrote about technology, the progressive left ascribes to capitalism. For Grant, would this be an accurate substitution? Or is capitalism a subset of the technological society?
That's a very fine question indeed. Not surprised it comes from Paul Barnes. Hi, Paul. You've asked a question that Sheila Grant addresses expressly in her afterword to the republication of Lament for a Nation. She says that the left has taken that kind of line, that the problem is with that Grant is really anti-right. But she points out that this is a misreading of chapter 7 of Lament for a Nation. The final section of Lament for a Nation, she said, is often underread. We need to go to that dense and extremely brilliant final chapter, chapter 7 of Lament for a Nation, to really understand what Grant's saying about why left and right is not relevant. And you've hinted at it in your question, Paul, because what you've intimated is that perhaps capitalism itself and the left are both subsets of technology, of this modern way of this world, what he calls the age of progress. And I think that's right. I think that the reason why right and left is not helpful is because the real problem is something that transcends both of them. And what Grant is telling us in so many different ways is we need to ask the harder questions about what is good for human beings and all human beings. It doesn't divide into right and left. It doesn't divide into state, big state, little state. It's much more profound than that. And I think in the years since Grant died, in the 30-something years, it's absolutely extraordinary how prescient he was about globalism and its increasing control mechanisms. We're seeing it in speeded up time with respect to COVID, I think. I think what we've seen happening with respect to surveillance and so on and the suspension of civil liberties because of this medical emergency, as we're told it is, shows us the tyrannous dimension of a technologically driven global order.
Okay, well, I'll turn to another question then from Keldon Formosa. How do you interpret Canadian history since 1950? It seems we used to be a more traditional and Christian society than the United States, but have since shifted to becoming a much more cosmopolitan, post-Christian type of country.
Yeah. I think this view of things is a mistake, because I don't believe we had a Christian country before either. I think what Grant points us towards is that the dynamo, as he calls it, this mechanistic drive of technology, was already deeply in place and starting to do its ever increasing work long before the 1950s in Canada or indeed any other country. The dynamo is what Lewis is seeing starting in the taking on board of magic by science in the 16th and 17th century with Bacon and the new science. So the problem for Christianity starts for Grant and for many others. Weber, in his book Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, really starts with the Reformation, where what happens is the community is diminished to the self. How it is with me and God becomes increasingly an individualistic thing. Now, it starts with a religious language in the Reformation, but it soon creates the conditions for greater and greater lack of religiosity. So secularized Christianity soon becomes simply secularized, and the Christianity diminishes. So, you have so many ridiculous things. You have the kind of baptism of militarism by religion. You have religion writing increasingly about the necessity, sad though it is, of abortion or euthanasia, things that for Grant and for many Christians are absolutely abominations. So Christianity starts to lose its way long ago. And I think the clues of where it went wrong are in Lewis, in many, many writers. There's a whole host of them. Christopher Dawson's essays on religion and culture are very important. Father Martin Darcy's book on Christian morals. He says in 1937 in that book, and by the way, he was a frequent speaker at the Socratic Club meetings, Martin Darcy. He says that for reasons he can't go into, the architecture of the relationship between Athens and Jerusalem has already been destroyed and, quote, is already forgotten, unquote, in 1937.
Well, thanks for that answer. I have another question from Dan W. I was surprised to hear the mention of Heidegger as a potential influence on Grant. Is there anything good in Heidegger's work worth drawing from?
There's been an entire study on Heidegger and Grant by Ian Angus, which you can find. So I would refer you to that. I think one of the finest critiques of values language that I've come across, referred to me by my friend, the Belgian, Swiss, Italian philosopher Christoph van Houte. He put me onto Heidegger's essay on humanism, in which he critiques values language as being the greatest blasphemy against being. So Heidegger, in that essay on humanism, which is a dense essay, as you may know, has a fabulous passage about how, in fact, values language is a blasphemy against being itself. So yes, there are good things we can draw, as there are in most things, by the way. It's always, I think, a mistake to categorically put someone on the side of the devils and other people on the side of the angels. Almost all of us are an admixture. St. Paul says, the good I would do, I don't do, and that I wish I didn't do, I do all the time. Aquinas and Aristotle say we're attracted to the good in everything. And I think this is really important to keep in mind. We may get the goods wrong. We may take the partial as the complete and thereby make an error. But it is the good that draws us. And when Leo Strauss refers to Thomas Hobbes as a natural lawyer, what he means is that Hobbes' selection of one concept from the natural law tradition, namely preservation of the self and elevation of it to a singular point, is still has Hobbes within the natural law tradition, however diminished. So with respect to Heidegger, I think, like any philosopher, there's going to be an admixture of, as I've said, the good and the confused and the partial. And this is simply, is it not, another aspect of human being?
Okay. Thanks for that answer, Ian. I'll move to a question by Christopher Takar, a member of the Newman Association and a lawyer. And he says, it seems to me that we use values rather than previously words like principle, including by the courts, because principles import a universal character, and use of values is to undermine the idea of universals or truth. So it's more of a comment than a question, but I guess he's asking if you agree with that.
Oh yeah, I completely agree with that. And indeed, so would some of the noble judges of the Ontario Court of Appeal, who in a decision not too long ago reject in very clear and eloquent ways the use of this increasingly ubiquitous and vacuous concept of charter values in law. Justice Peter Lowers and Justice Brad Miller, in their reasons for judgment in an Ontario case, the name of which for the moment escapes me, have, you'll be able to easily find it, both reject the use of charter values, which has been championed by some judges on the Supreme Court of Canada, but of course is just simply a subterfuge. It's an obscure, it's what Grant says, and it's an obscuring language for morality or law. We can do everything under the rubric of values. There's all kind. In fact, I'm writing a book on values. It's called the, I don't know when it'll happen, but my goal is to write a very big book on values. And one of the things I'm going to do is list all of the kinds of values people claim. In fact, the ironies here are so rich. C.S. Lewis badly handles value in that brilliant work that I love, The Abolition of Man. There's a section that he tries to deal with value, and I don't think does it that well. Grant stands really alone as somebody who understood the problem of values language. And I mean, in the Canadian context, Alan Bloom understood it very well in an American context. And Bertrand Himmelfarb understood it. Pierre Manon, the contemporary French writer, understands it. But there's a lot of bad handling. Even on, I just noticed in preparing for this talk that on the back of one of Grant's own books, if I can lay my hand on it, which I probably can't, but on the very back of his own copy of one of his books, it refers to Grant's evocation of core values. Of course, he does nothing of the sort. Grant would recoil in horror from the idea of core values. But the publisher thought, oh, here it is. The publisher thought it was an acceptable notion. Here it is right here. It's actually traditional values. Searching exploration of the fate of traditional values in modern society. Well, no, it's not that at all. What are traditional values? It's like St. John Paul II's use of universal values. There's no such thing as a universal value. It may sound nice, but the fact of the matter is we are going to try and make these things into a universal concept, but they're not universal by virtue of being values. The minute we use the term values, we've attached ourselves to something that our contemporary machine and our dynamic age understands to be paradigmatically subjective. We can talk about family values, Christian values. Those only mean the values of a Christian or a family or an Australian, but that doesn't even mean anything. In Australia, they're trying to make a citizenship test fill in our understanding of Australian values. Well, what are those? It depends which Australian you talk to. Are they in favor of abortion or euthanasia or against it? Are they in favor of immigration or against it? Are they in favor of mining or against it? Are they in favor of the environment or have another view? Climate change, all of these things. values are entirely subjective, and it is not a language that we can use and still speak meaningfully about virtues. And this is something that Grant said to me in a conversation on the phone. He was so gratified that I can still hear his voice. He had this lovely way of expressing himself. He said, "I'm gratified that you get this point about values." He said to me, he said, "I'm baffled how difficult it is to get this across." Baffled, he said. And in the 34 years since I had that phone conversation with Grant, nothing's changed. I hear bishops and people all over the world, popes writing about values as if they think it's communicating meaning. It isn't. It's just it's communicating confusion. We have to speak about the good, the true, the beautiful, the virtues by name: justice, wisdom, moderation, and courage. These are not subjected to the same subjectivism, properly understood, as values inevitably are, which is why I say they're like bailing a boat with a sieve. It is not going to work.
Well, thanks for that answer. We've had discussions about this, Ian, of course, and
For years.
and, I have defended the use of values language in Vatican II and by John Paul II, and I think they are talking about goods, objective goods, and they mean something different from subjective values.
Yeah, here's the point, though. People can hear us debate in real time. I mean, they mean something different, but things are heard in the manner of the hearer. And this is the problem. The term values now, to the modern person, to the person who's being schooled but not educated, as Grant would put it, the person who's being schooled in the age of progress, as he would call it, is a person speaking this language of the self, which emerges most profoundly in values. And in that exchange with David Cayley, Grant says, "I don't know what a value is." He says, to people use this language thinking they're communicating something they believe to be good and true and holy, without realizing that they're not communicating that to the person they're talking to. It's fallen into an abyss, this language. And it is the dominant language of our time which is dominated by technology and by subjectivism. Why does subjectivism and technology love this language from the marketplace? The value of something. Not its good, its value. Well, because it believes that what matters is this, what the self determines what matters, not what is.
Okay, well, I'll give you the last word on that. We have another question from Felix Doherty, and that's one that I can answer. He says, with deep remorse, I got sidelined. I was unable to log on. Will the recording be available to us who registered? Yes, it will. It will be available to the public on the Newman YouTube channel. So tell your friends or tell those who weren't able to watch the whole thing that they can come back and see the rest of it. I'm going to go, I can go back now to a couple of other questions. Let's see, Kelvin Formosa. Oh, we already got that one. They had another one. Let's see. Is there anything that the church should learn from philosophical liberalism? That's the question. I'm thinking here of the argument in Charles Taylor's essay, A Catholic Modernity, which suggests that sometimes the Spirit works outside the church and even against the hierarchical church in order to guide her and teach her.
Yeah, this is a very good and important question. And the answer is yes. The answer is that it goes back to the nature of truth itself. Truth is truth wherever it's found. So what is true and what should stand and be maintained as related to the goods of human being in forms of liberal articulation are still good and true. They'll tend to be more partial, less holistic, as Jan Smuts would have called it. Less holistic, less part of the whole, but they're still true, quote, as far as they go, unquote. The difficult task is how to think through the question of their scope and their application. because the thing about partialities is they can tend to unwrap or unwind the richer articulation and the richer conception. So it's a very difficult thing to try and figure out what to do. And you mentioned Charles Taylor in your question. I mean, Taylor is sometimes very, very good at bringing up new things. Sometimes wants to create a friendly face on something in a way that I don't think is helpful. I've disagreed with him quite strongly about his use of the term open secularism. I think that's a mistake. I've likened it to the attempt to have healthy botulism. You know what I mean? Botulism is just not healthy. And secularism was anti-religious in its inception. It was intended to be by George Jacob Holyoake, the man who coined it in 1851, despite his protestations to the contrary. You know, I mean, Holyoake said secularism takes no position for or against religion. This is not true. If you read his book, English Secularism, you can see that what Holyoake is trying to do is two things that secularism essentially does. One, it individualizes religion. And two, it privatizes it, and it marginalizes it, and privatizes and individualizes it. And so you can't have an open form of that, because by definition, what it's trying to do is minimize the public place of religion. Charles Taylor has wanted, for some reason, I suspect Quebec politics, because it came out of his work in relation to the Bouchard-Taylor Commission. I think for reasons of politics, Taylor has wanted to create an open secularism, but the best thing to do with secularism is just leave it as it is. If you want to have an open public sphere to encourage genuine diversity and what the Article 18 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights refers to as the public dimension of religious belief, the right to manifest, teach, disseminate, and be religious in the public, which is guaranteed by that important covenant. If you want to have a public sphere that includes religion, say so. Don't call it open secularism. It's not open secularism. It's just confusing. And if you want to have people attending to the good and the true and the beautiful and to metaphysics, don't call it values. Call it what it is: virtues, principles, objective norms. If you attach values to things, they fall into this slot of this inflated subjective self, no matter how good your intentions.
Maybe I can add a little question myself following from that. Didn't you at one time have a different understanding of secularism that would have been open to religious thought, that it was of the times, and it would have been something like what Taylor was talking about? I seem to recall you had an essay on secularism.
Yeah, I wrote an essay for McGill in a book edited by Douglas Farrow at McGill Queen's called "Considering Secularism." Somewhat cheeky title, because what I was getting at was the Supreme Court's use of the term secularism in relation to the Charter when it was never argued before them in the case of Chamberlain. And it wasn't in the statute that they had to interpret as the term secular was. Both my piece in defining and doing some historic work on the meaning of secular and the later one on secularism, we're trying to get the court to consider the actual origins of secularism. They got it right on secular in Chamberlain, but they then threw in all this stuff on secularism, which was not only not part of it has to be seen as what lawyers would call obiter dicta. It was not the central finding of the case, but it's had an influence, I think. And so no, the answer is I was never a fan of secularism once I understood what it was.
Okay, so there's a distinction between the term secular, which might be okay, and secularism, which is something quite different.
Yeah, well, you have to be careful about secular as well. People misuse this. I mean, all of these terms of framework, or how we discuss the paradigm of the culture that we're within, all of these terms have to be rethought in light of the idea of appropriate diversity and involvement, and that includes secular, secularism, public, private, person, individual. All of these key terms of contemporary jurisprudence need to be rethought, because we've tended to take them on board in ways that have already been badly damaged by this age of progress, as Grant calls it. And I think if there's one thing that we might want to do to save, to recoup and recraft and sharpen and reground our tradition, it needs to be a wholesale re-education project around key terms, because at the moment we are just lost and in a morass. We're wandering in a condition that can only be described as bewildered and often inarticulate. And we're sitting ducks for those who've captured the language to bring about their own, to force their will on everyone else. They know what they've done with the terminology, and we're just using it. And I think the church taking on values language is one of the most colossal mistakes. And I may say that recently, Marianne Glendon, to invoke a serious intellectual Catholic from Harvard Law School, Marianne Glendon has told me in the last couple of years on the phone when we spoke that, and she was the former president of the Pontifical Academy for Social Sciences, Marianne Glendon has said that she now completely agrees with the critique on values language. She believes it is not the language we should have been using in the church. And Chesterton said, when you realize you're on the wrong road, the most sensible thing to do is get on the right one. And I think the time for us using values in the church or in ethics or anything purporting to be Christian or Catholic or moral, it's high time to really jettison values. And here I disagree with some of the early writers on Grant, who suggested that we could somehow salvage values language. No, I don't think we can. And I think were Grant to be here today, I mean, I can't invoke him, but I can say I think if he saw where this had gone, particularly in things like Catholic education, he would say, nah, this is a term you need to, as we used to say in labor law, red circle it and get it out of there, not maintain it.
Maybe we only have a minute left. One very quick question, one from Paul Barnes. Besides yourself, who else do you think is carrying on the legacy of Grant today?
Oh, my word. Well, I think a lot of people who've been reading Grant have been influenced by him, and the extent to which they're willing to make these arguments in the public square would be a direct result of how well they've integrated his criticisms with their own work. So I mean, my students are all reading Grant, I can tell you. And I know lots of other professors who have introduced their students to George Grant. I hope that number will increase. I know of judges, friends of mine, who have read Grant with great benefit and would get others to read him. It's a discipline to read Grant, but it's, as I've said already several times, one that repays every minute.
Well, thanks very much, Ian, for your answers to our questions, and sure everyone enjoyed that. I'm going to pass it over now to Michael Goko, our president, who will wrap things up for us. Michael.
All right. We are very grateful to you, Dr. Benson, for being with us, and we are hoping that you'll come back to grace us with your presence at another time, for sure. Thank you as well to Dr. Klassen for leading the questions and for moderating them, and to all of you for attending, who came to be with us this evening, and we hope that you have enjoyed the event. As always, more information about the Newman Association Vancouver can be accessed through our social media pages and our email list. Information how to sign up is there on the chat box. You can also see information on membership and donations there on the same chat. We have various weekly faith formation activities, among other things, for our membership that you might be interested in joining if you'd like to formally be part of us. I guess we'll just end quickly with a prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. May he support us all the day long till the shades lengthen and the evening comes and the busy world is hushed and the fever of life is over and our work is done. Then in his mercy, may he give us safe lodging, a holy rest and peace at the last. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thanks everyone again. And we hope that you have a great rest of your weekend. God bless.